Have you ever noticed how your body knows something before your mind is ready to admit it? How your hands hesitate even when your thoughts insist you're doing the right thing? Because that's how it felt sitting in that office, with the rain tapping the window like it was counting down my last seconds of denial. The pen resting between my fingers warmer than it should have been, heavier than any pen has a right to feel. And the smell of expensive perfume hanging in the air, floral and sharp, the kind of scent that belongs to decisions that don't get taken back, while my phone buzzed again on the desk beside me, lighting up with my son's name for what felt like the 100th time, though I knew exactly how many times it had rung because grief turns you into an accountant of pain, and this was the 47th call in 3 days, each one ignored. Each one tightening something cold and clean inside my chest, the kind of clarity that arrives only after something sacred has already been broken. The lawyer's voice was calm, practiced, almost kind as she slid another document toward me and asked if I was absolutely certain. And I remember thinking how strange it was that strangers always ask that question after it's already too late to be uncertain, after the damage has been done, after the choice has already been made somewhere deeper than words. And as the clock on the wall clicked off another second, I wondered how many moments like this I had lived through without realizing they were endings disguised as pauses. How many times I had mistaken endurance for love, sacrifice for security, because 3 weeks earlier I had been standing in a wedding venue 4 hours from my home, watching crystal glasses catch the light and thinking this was what it all led to. This was the payoff for years of doing without, for working late shifts and coming home bone tired and smiling anyway, for putting my own wants on a shelf so high I eventually forgot what they looked like. And I didn't know then that I was already standing on the edge of something irreversible, that less than an hour later I would be asked to disappear quietly so someone else could feel more comfortable, that my presence would suddenly become inconvenient, that love would be measured not by history, but by how easily I could be removed. And I didn't know that the next morning my phone would ring not with an apology, but with a request so bold it would rearrange the entire architecture of my heart. But here I was now, in this office, the rain still falling, my son's name still glowing on a screen I refused to touch, and the lawyer waiting patiently while my signature hovered just above the line, because 4 words were coming. 4 words I would eventually say out loud that would stop his breath on the other end of the phone. And you don't speak words like that unless you've already crossed a line inside yourself, unless something has shifted from hoping to knowing, from enduring to deciding. And as I inhaled the cool, recycled air and felt the leather chair beneath me and heard the faint hum of the building settling, I realized this moment didn't begin here. It didn't begin with paperwork or legal language or a pen designed to feel important. It began earlier, much earlier. It began with a belief I had carried for decades that love meant always making room, always bending, always understanding, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt, because that's what mothers do, right? They absorb, they smooth things over. They take the hit so everyone else can keep moving forward. And I had done that for so long it felt almost wrong to sit still now, to let silence stretch without filling it with reassurance. But silence has a way of telling the truth when noise can't. And in that quiet, I could hear the echo of a laugh from a reception hall, see the way my son's tie sat slightly crooked the way it always did when he was excited, remember how proud I had felt watching him. How certain I was that whatever came next would be good because I had raised him to be good, and that certainty was the first thing to crack, because when love turns conditional, it doesn't announce itself. It just changes the rules overnight and waits to see if you'll notice. And I noticed, not all at once but in pieces, in the way my phone calls went unanswered until something was needed, in the way conversations became shorter and patience thinner, in the way my role quietly shifted from parent to obstacle without anyone ever explaining when or why. And sitting there with that pen, I understood something else too. That whatever I signed today wasn't revenge, it wasn't anger, it was recognition. It was the moment you stop arguing with reality and start acting accordingly. And when the lawyer cleared her throat softly, reminding me she was still there, I lowered the pen just enough to feel the paper beneath it and thought about how strange it is that a lifetime of giving can be erased in a single request, how quickly love can be reframed as control once it becomes inconvenient, how easily history is dismissed when it stands in the way of plans. And as the rain kept falling and my phone buzzed yet again, I finally let myself accept the truth I had been circling since that day at the wedding, the truth that led me here. That brought me to this desk and this decision and this silence, because before I could tell you what I signed or why it mattered or what those 4 words were, you need to understand what happened in that room full of music and laughter when my son walked toward me with a look that told me he had already chosen, and that's where this really begins. Have you ever walked into a place believing you belonged there, only to realize later that the invitation was conditional, that your welcome depended on how quietly you could exist? Because that's what I felt standing in that reception hall, with light spilling through tall windows and music floating just loud enough to blur the edges of conversation, my heels already aching even though I'd barely stopped moving. My fingers wrapped around a champagne glass I hadn't touched, telling myself to relax, to enjoy the day, to remember this moment for what it was supposed to be, because I had driven 4 hours before sunrise believing I was early, believing I was helpful, believing I was wanted. And there's a special kind of hope that lives in a mother's chest on her child's wedding day, a hope stitched together from years of scraped knees and late-night talks and quiet prayers. The belief that whatever else changes, your place in your child's life is solid, earned, unquestionable. And as I stood there watching servers line up desserts with careful precision, I kept thinking about how handsome my son looked. How familiar his laugh sounded even in a room full of strangers. How proud his father would have been if he were alive to see it. How I had chosen this dress carefully, navy blue and modest and just formal enough. The kind of thing I could barely afford but bought anyway because it mattered to show up properly, to look like I belonged in the story of his life. And I remember adjusting the collar once, twice, feeling it sit a little too tight around my throat, dismissing the discomfort as nerves, because surely this was just excitement. Surely this was what happiness felt like when it finally arrived. And I told myself that over and over while smiling at relatives I barely knew and nodding politely to people who asked how I knew the couple. My answers always the same, always proud, always certain. Until I noticed how long it had been since my son had looked in my direction, how conversations seemed to slide past me rather than include me, how easy it was to be invisible when no one needed anything from you in that moment. And I brushed that aside too, because weddings are busy, because I didn't want to be that mother, the one who reads too much into things, the one who makes the day about herself, the one who forgets that today is about him, so I waited. I watched, I held that glass and let the condensation soak my fingers, and I thought about the card tucked inside my purse, the one with the check I had saved for month after month, extra shifts stacked on top of exhaustion. Telling myself it was worth it because this was his beginning, and I had always believed my role was to make beginnings easier, not to stand in the way of them. And when I finally saw him walking toward me, weaving between guests with that familiar determined set to his shoulders, my first instinct was relief, warmth, the automatic smile that comes from seeing your child move through the world confidently. But something in his face stopped me mid-breath, because it wasn't joy or excitement or even nerves. It was focus, tight and purposeful, the look he used to get when he'd already decided how something would end. And I told myself again not to read into it, not to borrow trouble, because borrowing trouble has been my quiet specialty for years. And when he stopped a few feet away and said my name without smiling, just my name, no, Mom. No warmth, I felt the air shift, felt the room tilt slightly as if the floor had dipped under my feet, and I said something cheerful back, something safe, something that acknowledged the beauty of the ceremony and the happiness of the day. Because that's what you do when you sense tension and want to smooth it over, but smoothing things over only works when both people want smooth. And he didn't. He stood there not quite meeting my eyes. His gaze fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, as if speaking directly to me would make this harder than he wanted it to be. And when the words came, they landed with a weight I didn't understand at first. Not because they were complicated, but because they were so simple, so wrong in that setting, so out of place among the laughter and music and clinking glasses, and my mind rejected them before my body could catch up. My first thought that I must have misheard, that the music was too loud, that surely he hadn't said what I thought he said, and I remember blinking, tilting my head slightly, waiting for clarification. Waiting for him to laugh or explain or soften it, because surely this was a misunderstanding, surely this was not what it sounded like, and the pause stretched long enough to draw attention. Long enough for me to become aware of how tightly I was gripping that glass, how my fingers had gone numb, how my heartbeat had begun to thud in my ears louder than the music, and when he repeated himself, his voice low, controlled. As if managing a situation rather than speaking to his mother, something inside me went very still, because there are moments when shock doesn't explode, it collapses inward. folding you into yourself so completely that the world keeps moving while you stand frozen, watching from a distance. And I noticed absurd details then, the way someone nearby laughed too loudly, the way a man stumbled through a dance move, the way sunlight caught the edge of a tablecloth, because focusing on small things was easier than focusing on the meaning of what he was asking me to do. And when he finally looked at me, really looked. His eyes were different, not angry, not cruel, just firm, resolved, like someone closing a door and already turning the lock. And I wanted to ask why, wanted to ask how we had gotten here, wanted to remind him of the drive, the dress, the check, the years, but I also knew instinctively that this was not a conversation. It was a decision already made somewhere else with someone else, and I felt something shift again, a subtle realignment of understanding. The beginning of a realization that would take days to fully form, and as I set that untouched glass down and felt the cool tablecloth brush my knuckles, I understood that whatever I did next would echo far beyond this room. Because when love is tested publicly, it leaves marks that don't fade easily. And as I turned away and began walking through that hall with my head high and my chest tight, every step felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. And I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment that made the next morning possible, the moment that made the request that followed feel not shocking but inevitable, because once you see how easily someone can ask you to leave, you start to understand what else they might ask you to give up, and that's what you need to know before you hear about the phone call that came after, the one that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed without being accused of anything, not because you did something wrong, but because your presence suddenly felt inconvenient? Because that's what echoed in my head as I stood there trying to understand how a single sentence could erase decades, how a request delivered so calmly could feel more violent than shouting. And as the music pulsed through the floor and laughter rose and fell around us, I realized no one else knew what was happening. No one else could see that the ground had just shifted under my feet, and maybe that was the cruelest part. That I was being pushed out quietly, efficiently, without a scene, as if my disappearance was meant to go unnoticed. And I remember asking a question I already knew the answer to, something small and reasonable, because denial doesn't scream. It negotiates, it looks for loopholes, it asks for explanations, even when explanations won't change the outcome. And he gave me one, clipped and rehearsed, words that sounded like they had been practiced beforehand. Words about comfort and stress and how today wasn't the right time. Words that framed my removal as a favor, as something necessary for harmony. And as he spoke, I noticed how carefully he avoided certain phrases. How he never said, "I want you to leave," only "it would be better." How responsibility slid sideways until it rested somewhere just out of reach. And I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet for the sake of peace. All the times I had swallowed discomfort so someone else wouldn't feel awkward. And it struck me then how familiar this pattern was. How often women are taught that love means adjusting ourselves until we fit the space we're allowed, shrinking until we're no longer disruptive. And as that realization settled in, something else surfaced too, a sharp awareness of being watched, because across the room, seated perfectly at ease, was the person for whom this adjustment was being made, her posture relaxed, her expression pleasant, her eyes flicking toward us just long enough to register the outcome. And there was a look there I couldn't quite name at the time. Not triumph exactly. Not hostility, but certainty, the certainty of someone who knows the decision has already gone her way. And I understood then that this wasn't about me as a person. It was about me as a variable, something to be managed. Something that could be removed to stabilize the equation. And my son, my only child, stood between those two truths without hesitation, choosing efficiency over history, ease over loyalty. And when I asked him if he was sure, really sure, my voice surprised me by how steady it sounded, because part of me had already stepped back, already begun to observe instead of plead, and his answer came immediately, without pause, without doubt, and that was when the final thread snapped. Because hesitation would have meant conflict, but certainty meant conclusion, and I knew in that moment that staying would require me to beg for a place I had never begged for before, and leaving would require me to accept a truth I wasn't ready to face. But dignity has a way of asserting itself when everything else is stripped away. And I chose it not because I was brave, but because I was too tired to perform grief in public, too tired to argue my worth in a room full of strangers. So I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and turned away without touching him, without saying goodbye, without offering comfort to the person who had just hurt me. And as I walked through that hall, every step felt unreal. like moving through a memory that hadn't finished forming yet. The music suddenly too loud, the laughter too sharp, the air too warm, and I was acutely aware of my heels clicking against the floor, each sound marking distance, each one taking me further from the life I thought I still occupied. And I wondered briefly if anyone noticed, if anyone would later ask where I went, or if my absence would slide seamlessly into the evening without leaving a gap. And when I reached the doors and pushed them open, the sunlight hit me hard. Bright and unforgiving, the kind that makes you squint even when your eyes are already full, and the parking lot stretched out in front of me, ordinary and indifferent. Rows of cars waiting patiently for people who still belonged where they were, and I walked to mine slowly, feeling heat rise through the soles of my shoes, my body moving on instinct while my mind lagged behind. Still replaying the moment over and over, looking for a different ending, a word I could have said, a tone I could have used, anything that might have changed the outcome. And when I sat in the driver's seat and closed the door, the silence was so sudden it felt like pressure, my ears ringing as if I had stepped out of a storm, and I sat there for a long time with my hands on the wheel, not crying, not moving, just staring at the building in the mirror. Knowing that inside it my son was celebrating the beginning of his future while I was parked at the edge of it, already written out, and I thought about the card still in my purse, the one I had intended to give him with a hug and a blessing. And the absurdity of it made my throat tighten, because how quickly generosity can become invisible once you're no longer useful, and eventually I started the car and pulled away. The venue shrinking behind me as the road opened up ahead, 4 hours of asphalt and silence waiting. And as miles passed and the sun dipped lower, something inside me began to settle into a hard, unfamiliar shape, not grief exactly. Not anger yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when illusion dissolves and leaves reality exposed. And I didn't know it then, but that awareness was what made the next morning possible. What made the phone call that followed land not as a shock but as confirmation, because once someone shows you how easily they can remove you, you begin to understand how easily they can ask for everything else you have left. And that's what happened when my phone rang the next day, and I saw his name light up the screen. Have you ever answered a call hoping for remorse and heard entitlement instead? Because that's what happened the next morning when the sun was barely high enough to warm the back of my neck, and I was already awake. Already moving through the day on autopilot, hands in the soil, pulling weeds I'd ignored for weeks, my body aching in ways that felt earned and honest compared to the hollow ache in my chest. And when my phone buzzed in my pocket and his name appeared, a small, foolish part of me still wondered if this was it. If this was the moment he would say he'd made a mistake, that he was sorry, that he hadn't meant to hurt me. Because hope doesn't die cleanly, it lingers, it looks for evidence even after it's been disproven. And I wiped my hands on my jeans before answering, my voice neutral, careful, already bracing for impact. And the first thing he said told me everything I needed to know, not because it was cruel, but because it was casual, light, the tone of someone calling to check a detail. As if the night before had been nothing more than a scheduling issue that had resolved itself. And as he spoke, I waited, counting the seconds, expecting the apology to arrive after the greeting, after the pause, after the small talk. But it never came. Instead, he launched straight into what he needed, his words tumbling out with an eagerness that made my stomach drop. And when he mentioned the papers, said it like it was obvious I would understand. I felt the world tilt again, that same disorienting shift from the day before, because the speed of it was staggering, the way humiliation was followed so quickly by demand, like one naturally led to the other. And I asked him to repeat himself, not because I hadn't heard, but because I needed to hear it again to believe it. And he did, explaining in that upbeat, problem-solving voice he used when he thought he was being practical. Telling me how he and his wife had been talking, how someone she knew had ideas, how the timing was perfect. And as he spoke, I watched a bee move lazily between flowers near my feet, unbothered, purposeful. And I remember thinking how strange it was that life could continue so normally, while something fundamental was being stripped away. And when he finally paused for breath, I asked a simple question, the kind that reveals more than it accuses, and his answer came quickly, unguarded, because in his mind there was no conflict here, no reason for hesitation. This was just the next step. And that was when I understood that the night before hadn't been a mistake to him, it had been a clearing of space, a removal of an obstacle so this conversation could happen without friction, and the realization landed heavy and cold. Because it reframed everything, the wedding, the request, the timing, all of it snapping into a pattern I couldn't unsee. And as he talked about opportunity and potential and how things could be easier if I downsized, the words began to blur together. Not because they were complex, but because they were so detached from the reality I lived. The land he spoke of so lightly wasn't an asset to me, it was a history, a collection of hands and years and promises layered into soil and timber. And hearing it reduced to numbers and possibilities felt like listening to someone describe selling a family album page by page. And when I pointed that out gently, his tone shifted just enough to register impatience, the edge creeping in as if my attachment was an inconvenience he hadn't accounted for, and that was another small break, another adjustment in understanding. Because patience evaporates quickly when someone believes they're entitled to what you have, and I could hear movement in the background then, another voice chiming in briefly, indistinct but present. And the way his attention split told me everything about whose urgency mattered most. And as he outlined timelines and meetings and how quickly things needed to move, I felt something inside me go very still again. That same stillness from the lawyer's office, from the moment in the reception hall, the stillness that arrives when your mind finally stops arguing with what your body already knows. And I realized that he wasn't asking if I would send the papers. He was assuming I would, assuming compliance the way you assume gravity. And when I finally interrupted him, my voice surprised me with its calm, because calm is what happens when grief hardens into clarity. And I told him I needed time, not because I was unsure, but because I needed to see how he would respond to resistance. And his reaction came immediately, frustration leaking through. The polite tone slipping just enough to reveal expectation underneath. And that was the moment the last illusion fell away, because love asks, but entitlement instructs, and I could hear the difference now with painful precision. And when I ended the call without agreeing to anything, his confusion was almost genuine, as if he couldn't understand why the system wasn't working the way it always had. And as I set the phone down and looked out across the land he wanted so badly, I understood that the call wasn't about property at all. It was about power, about who got to decide what mattered and who was expected to adjust. And standing there in the morning light, dirt under my nails and history at my back, I knew the conversation wasn't over. But something had ended, something essential, because once someone asks you to trade your past for their convenience, there's no unhearing it, and by the time my phone buzzed again minutes later, I already knew I wouldn't be sending anything, and that the next steps I took would change everything between us. Do you know what an inheritance actually costs? Not in money, but in hands and years and bodies that wear down quietly so something can remain standing long after they're gone. Because that's the question that kept circling my mind after I ended that call, standing there with the morning sun climbing higher and the garden stretching out around me, every row and tree a ledger of effort no spreadsheet could ever capture. And I realized then how easily words like opportunity and development flatten stories into figures, how quickly history becomes negotiable once someone else decides it's standing in the way. And as my phone buzzed again and again, I didn't answer, not because I was playing a game, but because I needed to sit with the truth that had finally surfaced, the truth that my son wasn't confused about what he was asking. He simply didn't value what it cost to build what he wanted to tear apart, and that understanding hurt in a way that went deeper than the wedding ever had, because rejection can be explained away as emotion, but entitlement reveals belief. And belief is harder to forgive. And as I walked the length of the property that afternoon, the land he had spoken about so casually unfolded beneath my feet, the barn leaning just slightly the way it always had. The fence posts weathered but holding, the trees tall and steady, and with each step memories surfaced uninvited, not as nostalgia but as evidence, proof that this place wasn't idle or unused or waiting to be monetized. It was active in the only way that mattered to me, holding the weight of lives lived honestly, and I thought about my grandfather first, a man who worked himself into the ground to buy something he might never fully enjoy, who believed that ownership wasn't about control but about stewardship, about creating something that couldn't be taken away easily. And then my father, who spent weekends repairing what storms and time tried to undo. Not because it was profitable, but because it was necessary, because care itself has value even when it doesn't generate income. And then my husband, gone far too early, whose last request had been simple and absolute. Not about money or plans, but about protection, about keeping something intact in a world that constantly pushes for more, faster, bigger, and as those faces moved through my mind, layered over the land itself, I understood how absurd it was to be asked to sign it away like a spare room or an unused vehicle, how insulting it was to hear it described as just sitting there, as if preservation were the same as neglect. And when I replayed the call again in my head, his impatience stood out more clearly, the way he framed my attachment as resistance, as stubbornness, as something to be overcome rather than understood. And that's when the question shifted from what he was asking to why he felt entitled to ask it at all. And the answer settled in with uncomfortable clarity, because somewhere along the way my role had changed from guardian to gatekeeper. From person to obstacle, and obstacles are meant to be moved or removed, not respected. And I thought about how quickly his tone had cooled when I didn't immediately agree, how quickly frustration replaced familiarity. And that change told me more than any argument could have, because love doesn't disappear when you say no, only access does. And as I stood there listening to the wind move through the trees, I realized that every boundary I had avoided setting over the years had trained him to expect compliance, that my silence in the past had become his assumption in the present, and that was a hard truth to swallow. Because it meant this wasn't a sudden betrayal, it was a slow erosion I hadn't noticed until the ground finally gave way, and I felt a flicker of guilt then, not for what I was about to do, but for how long I had allowed my own history to be minimized in the name of keeping peace. And as the afternoon wore on and the calls turned into messages, each one more urgent than the last, I didn't read them all. But the fragments were enough, references to deadlines, to people waiting, to disappointment and frustration, language that framed my hesitation as a problem that needed solving, and not once did any of them ask how I felt, what the land meant to me, or why the request might be difficult, and that absence spoke louder than the words themselves, because when someone wants what you have more than they want to understand you, the relationship has already shifted into something transactional, and by evening, as the light softened and shadows stretched across the field, I found myself sitting on the porch steps, thinking not about what I would lose if I said no, but about what I would lose if I said yes, the quiet mornings, the continuity, the promise I had carried for decades. And I understood then that protecting legacy sometimes means disappointing the people who benefit most from forgetting it, and that realization didn't come with anger or drama. It came with a calm resolve that surprised me. Because once you recognize what's at stake, the decision stops feeling complicated. And as my phone buzzed yet again and I finally turned it face down on the table beside me, I knew the next step wouldn't be a conversation or a compromise. It would be an action, something quiet and final. And by the time the stars came out and the house settled into night, I had already decided where I would go the next morning and why. Because when legacy is threatened, silence is no longer protection. And that's when I knew I was done waiting. What happens when you stop responding? When you remove yourself from the cycle that trained people to expect immediate access to you, because that's what I learned over the next few days as I let the phone sit where it was. Face down on the table, its small vibrations rattling softly against the wood like a trapped insect. Each buzz another reminder of how quickly concern turns into pressure once compliance is no longer guaranteed. And the first few hours felt strange, almost wrong, because silence goes against every instinct I had spent decades cultivating, the instinct to smooth things over, to reassure, to explain myself before anyone could misunderstand. But this time I didn't explain, I didn't answer, I didn't soften anything. And instead I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, cleaning rooms that didn't need cleaning, opening drawers I hadn't opened in years, letting my hands stay busy while my mind recalibrated to a new reality. And as the hours passed, the messages changed tone, starting polite, then confused, then sharp, the words shifting from just checking in to "we need to talk" to "this is time sensitive." And I watched the pattern unfold with a kind of detached clarity, because urgency is often just entitlement wearing a watch. And every unanswered call seemed to escalate the stakes in their minds, while something inside me grew quieter, steadier, as if my nervous system finally realized it didn't have to respond to every demand dressed up as necessity. And I spent that first night in the old armchair by the window, the one that still carried the faint imprint of my husband's presence, listening to the house settle and creak the way it always had. And I thought about how many times I had mistaken availability for love, how often I had equated responsiveness with care, and it occurred to me then that silence wasn't cruelty, it was information. It was the only way to see what remained when my immediate reassurance was removed, and what remained wasn't concern for me, it was panic over access, and that distinction mattered more than I had ever allowed myself to admit. Because when the messages began referencing lawyers and rights and what I owed, any lingering doubt evaporated, replaced by a stark understanding that this situation had crossed from family conflict into something colder. Something governed by leverage rather than affection. And the next morning I walked the property again, not out of sentiment but out of grounding, touching the rough wood of the barn, running my fingers along the fence line. Letting physical reality anchor me while my phone filled with missed calls I refused to catalog, and I realized that by not answering, I had shifted the balance of the entire relationship because suddenly I was no longer reacting. I was choosing, and that terrified them because people who rely on your predictability panic when you become unpredictable. And by the third day, the messages had taken on a different texture altogether, guilt threaded through accusation. Reminders of family layered over thinly veiled threats, the language of obligation deployed with increasing desperation, and I read just enough to understand the direction it was heading without absorbing every word, because I didn't need to. The pattern was already clear, and in that clarity I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not satisfaction, but relief, the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting the truth and start aligning with it. And as I sat at the kitchen table that afternoon, sunlight slanting across the floor, dust motes floating lazily in the air, I knew the next step couldn't be another conversation, because conversations can be twisted, delayed, revisited. And what I needed now was permanence, something that didn't rely on emotion or explanation, something that couldn't be argued with once it was done, and that realization came with a surprising sense of peace. Because once you accept that some relationships can't be saved by talking, action becomes the only honest language left, and when I finally picked up my keys and placed them deliberately on the table beside the phone, I knew exactly where I was going and why, not out of spite or revenge, but out of responsibility, because protecting something fragile sometimes requires a decisiveness that feels uncomfortable at first. And as I locked the door behind me and stepped into the quiet afternoon, I understood that by the time I returned, nothing would be the same, because silence had done its work. It had stripped away illusion, exposed motive, and made room for a decision that could no longer be postponed, and the place I was headed next would turn that decision into something no one could undo. Have you ever walked into a place knowing that when you walked back out, there would be no version of your life where you could pretend nothing changed? Because that was the weight I carried with me as I stepped into that quiet office on Main Street. The kind of place people usually visit after something has already gone wrong, when grief or conflict has finally grown teeth, and the woman behind the desk looked up with polite surprise as I gave my name. Her expression shifting subtly as recognition settled in, because she had seen me before, years earlier, when loss had brought me in trembling and uncertain, and now I stood straighter, calmer. Not because I felt brave, but because something inside me had already accepted the cost of what I was about to do. And as I sat down and explained everything, not in fragments but in order, the wedding, the call, the demands, the land, the pressure, the silence, I heard my own voice from a distance, steady and unembellished, as if telling the story that way made it easier to see the shape of it. And when I finished, she didn't interrupt or rush me. She simply nodded once and asked a question that mattered more than any other. What do you want to protect? Not who do you want to punish? Not how do you want to respond? But what do you want to protect? And the answer came without hesitation: the land, the promise, the history, because those were the only things that hadn't changed in all of this. And she leaned back slightly and explained the option that would make everything permanent, using careful words, outlining boundaries that couldn't be crossed once established. And as she spoke, something in my chest loosened, because for the first time since the wedding, the future stopped feeling like a negotiation and started feeling like a decision. And she warned me more than once that this wasn't reversible, that once signed, there would be no appeals to emotion, no family discussions that could unwind it. And I listened carefully, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain that there was no back door, no loophole someone else could later exploit. And when she slid the papers across the desk and placed the pen beside them, the room seemed to go very still, the hum of the building suddenly louder, the faint scent of paper and ink sharp in the air. And I thought briefly about all the times I had signed things without fully reading them, trusting that relationships would hold where contracts ended, and how naive that felt now. And as I picked up the pen, it felt exactly like it had days earlier, heavier than it should have been, not because of its weight, but because of its finality. And I paused just long enough to ask the last question I needed answered: once this is done, There's no way for anyone else to undo it. And when she said no, not firmly but factually, something settled into place because certainty doesn't always come with relief. Sometimes it comes with resolve, and I signed slowly at first. Then more confidently, my name flowing across the page in a way that felt deliberate, each letter a line drawn between what was and what would never be again. And as I moved from page to page, the significance of it deepened. Not as drama, but as gravity, the understanding that I was choosing permanence over appeasement, protection over peacekeeping. And when the final signature was complete and the papers were gathered and placed neatly into a folder, I felt an unexpected calm, the kind that comes when a decision finally matches the truth you've been living with. And my phone buzzed then, right on time, as if summoned by the moment, and I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Because some people sense when control is slipping, and when the lawyer asked if I wanted to take the call, her voice neutral but knowing, I nodded, because there are moments when silence has done all it can do. And the only thing left is to speak. And as I picked up the phone and answered, I knew that whatever I said next would land differently now, because the decision had already been made, the ink already dry. And the 4 words I had rehearsed without realizing it were finally ready to be spoken. Have you ever noticed how begging sounds different once it arrives too late? How the tone shifts from certainty to panic in a single breath? Because that's what I heard the moment I put the phone on speaker and said his name. His voice already frayed, already chasing something he could feel slipping away, and before he could finish whatever apology he was assembling from regret and fear, I stopped him, not with anger but with calm. The kind of calm that only comes after a decision has been sealed somewhere deeper than conversation, and I told him to listen carefully because I wasn't going to repeat myself, and there was a pause on the line then. The kind that happens when someone senses a door closing and rushes forward hoping to wedge a foot inside before it shuts completely. And he promised things in rapid succession, apologies stacked on assurances. Vows to fix what had broken, to make things right, to talk to whoever needed talking to. And I let him finish because I needed him to hear himself, to recognize the desperation in his own voice. And when he finally ran out of words, I said them quietly, evenly, without emphasis. 4 words that landed heavier than any argument ever could. It's not yours anymore. And the silence that followed was absolute. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that feels like falling, like the moment just before impact when your body realizes gravity has taken over. And I could hear him breathing, shallow and fast. His mind racing ahead of his mouth, trying to rewrite reality in real time. And when he finally spoke, confusion cracked through the panic, asking what I meant, insisting there must be a mistake. That I couldn't have done something so final without consulting him, without considering how it would affect his future. And I explained then, calmly, carefully, not to persuade but to inform that the papers were signed, that the land was protected permanently, that it could never be sold or developed or claimed by anyone again. And with each sentence his voice rose, disbelief sharpening into outrage, threats tumbling out about lawyers and rights and what he was owed. And I listened without interruption because none of it mattered anymore. Because the power of a decision like this is that it removes the need to argue. And when he finally paused, breathless and angry, I told him the part he didn't want to hear, that it had never been his inheritance to demand, that it had been entrusted to me with a promise attached, a promise I had kept. And he accused me then of choosing land over family, of valuing dirt more than my own child, and his words might have worked once, might have pierced straight through me when guilt was still a lever he could pull, but now they slid past. Because I understood something he didn't yet, that honoring legacy isn't the same as abandoning love, that consequences aren't cruelty, they're the natural result of choices made without regard for the people they affect. And I reminded him of the wedding, not to punish, but to anchor the conversation in reality, of the way he asked me to leave, of how easily he removed me from a room full of witnesses, and how quickly he followed that removal with a demand. And when I asked if he truly believed nothing would come of that, his silence answered for him, and I could hear someone else in the background then, a sharp voice cutting in, demanding explanations, and for a brief moment I felt a flicker of sadness, not satisfaction, because this wasn't victory, it was consequence unfolding in real time, and when he tried one last time to bargain, to suggest compromises and partial solutions, I ended the conversation the same way it had begun, with clarity, telling him there was nothing left to negotiate, that the decision was irrevocable, and that for the first time since this began, I was at peace with that, and I ended the call before he could respond, not out of spite, but because the conversation had reached its natural end. And as I set the phone down and looked around the quiet office, the lawyer watching me with something like respect, I felt the weight of months lift from my shoulders, not because I had won, but because I had stopped losing pieces of myself trying to be understood by someone who no longer listened. And as I walked out into the afternoon light, the world looked unchanged, traffic moving, people passing, ordinary life continuing. But I knew that somewhere behind me a future had collapsed and another had quietly taken its place. And while I didn't yet know what the fallout would look like or how long the silence would last, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. The words I had spoken could not be taken back, and neither could the choice that had made them true. Have you ever looked around after everything finally goes quiet and realized that what you lost wasn't a person, but an illusion you had been protecting for years? Because that was the understanding that settled over me in the months that followed. When the phone stopped ringing and the messages tapered off into nothing, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, not tense or expectant, but spacious, honest, the kind that allows you to hear your own thoughts again. And at first I braced myself for regret, for the hollow ache everyone warns you about when you draw a line that can't be erased. But what came instead was a steady calm, not happiness exactly, but alignment. The feeling of living in a way that no longer contradicted the truth I had been avoiding, and life didn't suddenly become easy or uncomplicated. It simply became clearer, and clarity has a way of making even loneliness feel purposeful. Because in that quiet, I began to see how much energy I had spent managing other people's comfort, smoothing over tensions that were never mine to resolve, and how little of that effort had ever been reciprocated. And when news eventually reached me through proper channels, filtered and distant, that the marriage had unraveled under the weight of expectations it could never satisfy, I felt no vindication. Only sadness for the version of my son who had believed shortcuts could replace character. And when a letter arrived months later, handwritten and unguarded, full of remorse and recognition that came too late to repair what had been broken, I let myself cry for the first time since the wedding, not because I regretted my decision, but because grief doesn't disappear just because you make the right choice. It simply changes shape, and I read his words slowly, acknowledging the understanding he had finally reached, and then I folded the letter and set it aside, not as a rejection but as a pause, because forgiveness doesn't require immediate reunion, and healing doesn't demand access. And in the space that followed, I turned my attention back to the land itself, not as a symbol of defiance but as a living reminder of continuity, walking its paths in the early mornings, watching seasons shift without asking permission, feeling grounded in a way I hadn't in years, and I began sharing it, quietly, intentionally, inviting children who had never seen open fields or old trees to explore and learn, to understand that some things exist not to be consumed but to be cared for. And in their curiosity and laughter, I saw the future my grandfather and father had imagined without ever meeting it. And that understanding filled a place in me I hadn't known was empty. And as spring returned and growth pushed through soil that had held steady through everything, I understood the final lesson this story had been trying to teach me. That legacy isn't about what you leave behind for people to take. It's about what you protect so others can grow. That love isn't proven by how much you surrender, but by whether what you give is honored or exploited. And that sometimes the most compassionate act for yourself and for those who hurt you is allowing consequences to do the work you can't. And if you're listening to this and feeling a familiar ache, if you've ever been made to feel disposable once your usefulness ran out, know this: your worth is not measured by what others demand from you, and your story doesn't end the moment someone stops choosing you. Sometimes it begins there. When you finally choose yourself, and the question I'll leave you with is the same one I had to answer in that lawyer's office. What would you protect if you stopped being afraid of disappointing the people who only value you for what you provide? Because the answer to that question tells you everything about who you really are, and once you know it, you'll never see silence the same way again.